present. So hello and welcome to GGU Presents. It's great to have everybody here. I'm Michael Baisley. We have been on hiatus for the last couple of months, but we are back with what I know will be a very interesting show. Marijke Smit of the architecture firm MKThink is here to help us talk about space. Not the stuff up there above us that Elon Musk is trying to conquer, but the space around us in which we work every day and where many of us spend a third of our lives, if not more. It's maybe not something that many of us think about too much once we get settled in for the day and figure out where our desk is and our chair and whether the lighting is pleasant or not, or whether or not we have a view of the world outside. Most of the time we just go about our business and do our work. MKThink and people like Marijke, though, think about workspace all the time and how to make it better and more functional and more aligned with the goals of an organization. So we're going to talk about that and how our workplace environment has been changing and how some of that is being accelerated by working from home and the changes that have been brought about by the COVID pandemic. Suddenly, where we are going to work and what workplaces are going to look like in the coming years is a huge topic of discussion. Countless articles have been written about it as the topic of friends and colleagues, and it's something we've actually been discussing here at GGU with MKThink as we figure out how to optimize our space more efficiently and how to accommodate the desires of a large number of our employees who would now prefer not to come into the office every day, who feel like they are more productive and happy working at home. They don't want the long commutes anymore and they like the convenience. Or maybe they're just not completely comfortable yet being around other people. So I think this will be a great show. Let's introduce Marijke. Marijke is a principal at MKThink and leads its work in human performance, helping clients like GGU solve complex problems about their built environment, while optimizing learning outcomes in the education and workplace spheres. She's trained in history and urban planning at Columbia University. Her 25-year career has focused on uncovering the nexus between people, place, and programs using data-driven insights to inform better decision-making. For the past year and a half, Marijke's work has focused around leveraging the seismic shifts caused by the pandemic towards achieving long-term organizational goals and objectives. She's been working with GGU specifically to help optimize space on campus in support of student and staff experience within a post-pandemic paradigm. Her diverse client list includes GGU, Stanford University, UC Hastings, Boston Private Bank, University of Maryland, Global Campus, the Nature Conservancy, Oakland Unified School District, and the New York Police Academy, among others. Oh, and the Hawaii Department of Education. So welcome, Marijke. It's great to have you. Real quick, jump in. I want to let our viewers know that if you have any questions that you want us to try to answer during the show, you can hit the Q&A button right there at the bottom of the screen, and we'll try to get those as we go along. Well, let's get to it. What is MKThink and what do you do there?
Well, MKThink has been described in a number of ways. I think probably the most coherent way is talking about us as the ideas company for the built environment. What we are really is a multidisciplinary design firm. And we came together around the ethos, build less, solve more. What does that mean? That really, it was a response, I think, when our founder, Mark Miller, founded the company 20 years ago, to an industry that really tried to solve problems by building new space. Right. Any problem it saw, it had to do with we need to start fresh and clean, and understanding that a lot of times those were very costly endeavors that ended up being an anachronism by the time they were opening day. So the company was really founded about uncovering some of the patterns and the realities to help our clients build a firm foundation in the decisions that they make around space. And so, as we all know, and it's been very clear during the pandemic that space cannot be seen in a void. It really has to do with that nexus between how people use space, the things they're trying to achieve with the space, but mostly it's really there to support activities. So that's kind of what we really focus a lot of our attention on. And in order to do that correctly, we really need to use qualitative and quantitative data to measure how people are actually using space, as sort of different from how they say they're using space, which is often where the interesting things lie.
So talk a little bit about the data. I'm really curious because I've seen you just mentioned it now and I've seen that written elsewhere. What do you mean by using data to solve some of these problems and answer questions?
Well, I think it's starkest contrast, right? The industry, I'm speaking about architecture, really would make decisions based on expertise and hunches, right? Often kind of assuming things that may or may not be the reality. And what we wanted to do was sort of uncover and get at that and try to understand what actually is happening. So by using data, we use it both qualitatively and quantitatively. The qualitative side is really, really looking at interviews and talking to people, and trying to divorce them from a conversation about space. Actually, we're really trying to get at what their activities are. And then we relate that information to a lot of things that we've learned around the built environment, whether it's, what the existing space condition is. And then we also fold in information like scheduling data, things that typically aren't necessarily interacting with building data, but that is what uncovers the insight. So we can look at things like utilization, how people are actually using space, how long they dwell in certain places, where the most favored spaces are. We look at the environmental qualities of that space. A lot of times the answers lie in pretty simple answers. People don't use that room because it's stuffy and there's no AC, right? And so you start kind of layering on these patterns, and we put that all into a relational database that allows us to make those sort of relationships and understand the interdependencies at play. Whereas typically folks would really just be looking at the spatial components of something. We're trying to layer in health data, scheduling data, all the other factors that we think are interplaying with space. So we do a lot of data collection in the beginning. We have what we call our discovery process, where we're not making any assumptions. We're not even assessing what we're learning. We're just really gathering data and trying to make them so that we can make apples to apples comparisons. And then we start really kind of thinking about how to assess that. And we create scenarios out of the data. And we start kind of creating frameworks with our clients around how to look at that data differently.
Why is this so important? We've been going to offices for decades, and with traditional setups, offices, cubicles, and everything like that. Why do we need to be thinking about space and what it looks like and feels like, and how does it contribute to worker happiness and productivity?
Well, I mean, for one, traditionally, I think we spend about a third of our lives in workspaces, which is a pretty depressing statistic, but nonetheless, it's a real place that we have to, have thinking around. And we know statistically, or there's a lot of correlations between, spatial conditions, environmental conditions, and productivity. The light, air quality, et cetera, those things play a big impact. And now we add in the health component, right? We know that there's certain places where it's dangerous to be. So we want to make sure that we're, creating the healthiest places possible. But I think now more than ever, as people are sort of reemerging from their homes, they need to understand why they're going someplace. We have many choices before us now. And the why is becoming a question that's been highlighted about, well, why would I go to an office? What purpose does that office solve for me in the work that I do and the activities that I have? And so it's really more trying to answer that question. And then from folks who are managing those assets, the space, they say, well, okay, if we're not going to be having folks here all the time, what role does this space play? Do we need all of it? Do we need to change the experience of it? Because the conditions upon which people are going to the office or going to a campus, for that matter, are changing. And so we need to create more conditions that are intentional. What are those experiences that we're trying to design when we do have folks go to a place, rather than just assuming it'll always be there, right? We always assumed that the office was there, we had to go, we had to spend 2 hours commuting every day. Well, we've kind of revealed that we don't have to do that. So what then is going to be the draw? What are the interactions we're looking for? What are the relationships we're looking for? All of those things are coming into question. So really mapping the activities that you're desiring as an organization from your employees, and mapping that to what you can produce in the space. Sometimes that yields a lot of space savings. Sometimes it says we want to use our space very differently. We actually want to make it bigger because we want to create a conferencing center, and so I think that the opportunity now lies for really a reimagining of what that is, based on true intention about what people are doing, rather than assumptions that we've held from the past.
Exactly. So the world is changing, and we've alluded to that a couple of times here. So how is COVID affecting the work that you and MKThink do, and what trends are you seeing accelerating because of that right now?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost a question. It's like, well, which phase of COVID, right? We've been through so many lives in the last 18 months, and I think we've been there with our clients throughout the whole experience, at first trying to just help people figure out, is the sky falling and how does that work? And I think once we all realized that we could function, outside of our traditional offices, the conversations started changing a little bit. And I think some of those opportunities that were revealed, and I think GGU saw this opportunity quite early, was, well, how do we use this as an opportunity, right? Folks aren't in their offices now. They're not wed to these spaces that they just assumed were going to be there every day. And they're now starting to see some of the bright spots of being at home with their families, et cetera. So how do we leverage that and really refashion the campus in a way that is that intention I was talking about earlier? And one of the benefits is that you have stakeholders, faculty, staff, students who are able to look at the campus and their environments quite differently because they're not in them every day and they're not owning them in the same traditional sense that they always have. And then moreover, just simple stuff, like it seems silly, but laptops, right? When you equip everyone with laptops, it's amazing how flexible they can be and where they can work. And so just seeing how easily that transitional, however hard it really was, but actually in the logistics of it were quite seamless for a lot of organizations, that opened up a lot of opportunities. And I think it's opened up a lot of choices for folks as they sort of navigate their personal lives with their work lives and sort of what that identity is. And from an employer standpoint, from a university standpoint, or an organization standpoint, they can start really seeing, well, what opportunities exist for us to refashion ourselves, right? Either we had old norms that no longer are relevant. We have new leadership. We want to change the style of how we interact in our culture. So in essence, it gives a little bit of a free slate, a breathing room, if you will, to kind of start thinking and questioning the old norms. And what's different, I think, is that not just the leadership is seeing this, but everyone, because we've all been a part of this experiment, right? We're all seeing the pros and cons of this in real time at the same time. And it means different things for different people. And there's things to capitalize on either side of the equation.
So the pandemic, like you said, there's been these different phases and there's been this arc. And at the beginning, I think a lot of us were thinking this is going to last not too long. We're going to get through it. Back in March of last year, we were probably thinking this is going to be weeks or maybe a few months. And our expectations about that started to evolve to where we are now. At what point did you see organizations, and you mostly work with nonprofits and educational institutions, right?
Yep.
At what point did you see them begin to sort of open their eyes and realize that this is an opportunity to do something?
I think it really was a couple of months in, because I think in the first couple of months, it was really dealing with operational sky is falling. How do we deal with this changing quicksand of new regulations, guidelines that we have to adhere to, our students coming or going? And once folks made the basic decisions about let's be remote, we're going to actually take a semester off or a year off, then we started getting some breathing room for making some longer term decisions. But for the first several months, our clients just weren't able to see the forest through the trees. And quite frankly, it was hard for us as well, right? Because we were having our own issues as an organization. But I think one of the things that we spent most time with is trying to decouple or uncouple rather, the issues of the pandemic from what's the future state. The pandemic was offering an opportunity to rethink things, but it wasn't the end game, right? And so trying to help folks imagine, a future state that, definitely there was learnings to gain from there, but most of all, it could be an accelerant rather than a wholesale new cloth, right? We already had these goals. We have an opportunity to advance these goals now. And so let's advance the goals that we think are going to not change and de-risk the other parts of the equation. So that really started happening a couple of months in when we started really doing longer range planning again, because everyone had a sort of a sigh of a moment of, okay, we've got some room to breathe here.
There certainly was a point when we started to hear a lot about companies, big companies saying, okay, we're going to let people continue to work from home until X. And then it was like, we're going to let people continue to work at home indefinitely. And then it was like, we're going to let most people work at home, period. So there definitely was this arc that was happening here. You shared an article about higher ed from the Chronicle of Higher Ed that said there was a statistic about how more than 50% of higher education leaders were expecting to give more flexibility to their employees. And then that figure grows even higher as they look 5 years out. So that's huge. I wonder, did you expect to see so many organizations where so many employees wanted to continue working at home?
No, I don't think any of us saw that, right? But it was again in those waves as we got more data and more understanding what other companies were doing. We started looking for benchmarks elsewhere and sort of kept looking around to see what other calls were being made. And I think too, another pressure at play was this need to retain workers and attract new workers, right? And so that's at play. And so some of this it's not about do employees just want to stay at home. It's about also, they are getting many offers that are competing and say you can always stay from home, right? And so what is that? What are we demanding as employers of our staff? We need to really think of a new set of trade-offs for folks that really meet them where they are. And I think that that's a really new challenge for universities specifically. And I think too, as universities, their student base changes as well and the needs of their student base, because they're also finding that they can be remote in ways that they didn't anticipate before. That changes the complexion of what staff needs to be there for their students, right? And what is that ratio? So since both are changing, there's a calibration that needs to happen based on the different student body you have. And every university obviously has its own, different set of both, faculty, staff, and student relationships. The more traditional campuses may still say we're going to be pretty traditional because we're a campus-bound university, where others will say, well, actually, we can really increase enrollment if we offer more online courses for folks who are working late at night, et cetera. So I think that it's opening up a lot of opportunity, but that calibration isn't over. And I think that the other thing that we're finding is people are much more willing to sort of not wait and see, but try and see, right? They're trying new things, they're prototyping, they're testing, and there's a little bit more understanding that that's okay. You don't have to have the final answers yet. There's some things we can put in place and measure and test before we make big term investments.
Right. I think in the same article, it talked about a turnover tsunami.
Yeah.
Potentially happening at some of these universities. So that development then, and sort of an unexpected development, then how has that affected the work that you do at MKThink and what you consider to be built environments that maybe look differently now when you've got people coming and going in a way that you didn't have? I mean, before it used to be, you might have 4 or 5 or 6 people who have telecommuting agreements. And that was, it was relatively small percentage. Now we've got half or more people who are talking about coming and going. How does that change the way you design a workplace? What are some of the things that start to look different?
Well, I think understanding the element of time has become a new priority. We've always looked at that in terms of scheduling, but now you can't be looking or designing space without understanding, how sequence and time are working, how presence on campus has changed, and how do you design around that? It's easy to say, well, you design flexible environments, of course, but you still need to design what level of flexibility you're looking for and have to project the amount of students or staff that you're looking to house at any one time. So we spend a lot of time really working on profiles of different types of workers, of staff, of students that kind of typify one type of an experience and understand what their user journey might be, what their level of presence on campus might be throughout a week, throughout a semester, throughout a year. And we model that so that we can kind of really understand programmatically what that means for presence. Like, is this type of student, is this type of staff member going to be on campus for 2 hours a day, or are they going to be throughout the day, right? And so what it does depend on is really understanding the nature of scheduling and having tools to schedule remotely. For instance, software that allows you to see who's in the office at any given time. You can actually schedule space, and the space really has to be there to map to the functions that you're trying to have. So if you want to go into an office, you don't want to not know whether you have space when you're going to go into the office. You want to know that you have your setup that you like. It's going to be near your colleagues, near your students. And so the ability to schedule in that type of space while you don't own it. And I think that's the critical difference, is that you can't assume if someone's going to be on campus 2 days a week that they get their own office anymore, right? And so some type of sharing relationship has to come into play, and different organizations obviously respond differently to that, because many are used to having, their certificates on a wall, or their name on, their desk, their family photos. So that notion is really going to have to change. But I think as long as there's spaces that do support the type of things that they're doing, that are available for them, and they're not challenging to schedule in, that relationship will be okay. But that's been a big change for a lot of folks.
Right. No, definitely. We're experiencing that here at GGU. We're going to have a lot more hoteling spaces than we ever have before. And that's going to be an adjustment for people. How is that going to go, do you think? Because that's a big deal. Like you said, most people are used to being able to walk into work and have their defined space with their pictures of their kids hanging up in their cat calendar or whatever, all of these things, and their files from the day before sitting there waiting for them. Now suddenly it's an empty desk, and where are all the accoutrements of their work? Where do they come from? How do you think people are going to adapt to that?
Well, it's a good question, because I think that's why we're planning in a pretty robust change management. So we're really trying to see and starting out with really what are the functional changes before we make any big architectural moves and create shiny new spaces. Let's really figure out some of those functional things that we can adjust to. And I think another part of it is also creating value and benefits, right? So it's not just about taking away your personal space. It's about giving you other types of spaces and the ability to circulate throughout your day. You have any meeting space available. So it's really how do you highlight the benefits of this for anyone working? And then you can't discount the fact that if folks really want to work from home, that's a huge benefit, right? So they don't have to commute X hours a day. So, they can limit that to certain days of the week and at the times or the hours that they really think that they're going to need. So there's multiple benefits, but it's our job also to highlight what those are. But I think even down to the very nitty gritty is making sure that people understand every piece of this, right? You can't just hope for the best. We really are going to be doing a series of tutorials and Q&As to sort of help folks through that process, but also have to adjust where it's not working, right? I don't think there's any assumption that it's going to be seamless out of the gate. The assumption is that there will be tweaking that needs to happen, and remodeling and retesting. So, I think asking for folks' grace as well during that period, just so that we're all in this together. We're trying to get it right together. And this is a time of change. So it's really critical that we're all partners in that investigation.
We've talked before about iterating and continuing to sort of adapt to what we learn as we go along working in these new spaces, and the space being able to sort of adapt. You just sort of alluded to that right there. I have a feeling nobody's going to want to come into work on Fridays. I just have everybody's going to want to work at home so they can get an early start on the weekend, and they don't want to have to deal with the Friday traffic and stuff like that. So that's an element right there that you have to sort of factor in, right? And maybe the same, it's going to be true for Mondays too. So now you're working with Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. That is going to be the time when a lot of people are going to maybe want to be in the space and sort of the shared space at work. Are you thinking about those types of patterns and behaviors and how those might play out over time here?
Yes, definitely. And there's different ways to look at that. And what we're finding with many of the clients that we're working with is that it's probably working best on a team-based arrangement, where the teams really who understand that the type of work they have to do are making those informal relationships among themselves, right? And so what you're doing is providing a certain amount of space, which may be in a reduced footprint, may not be, because you're leveraging the fact that folks won't be there, all of them won't be there at the same time. But creating those relationships where it's like, okay, well, we really need coverage in these days of the week. And so that you're working with a department or a set of employees who are symbiotic and understanding how to work together on that, so that you don't find those extreme peaks, right? That everyone's in the office on Wednesdays, but no one's in the office on Fridays. And then also where those will exist regardless, we plan around that and perhaps look at different scheduling of classes as well. So I think that that's been an interesting process as well, is not just discovering what the staff wants, right? Because you can also control that with some policies, but also sort of where are the students now looking, what do they want? We can't assume that those patterns that we measured back in 2019 have any relevance now, right? So they also have discovered a whole new set of values and times that work for them. They don't have to necessarily rush downtown to get back on transit, et cetera. So we have to really be mapping and looking at what those changes are as well.
Right. And you do a lot of your work in the educational space, and obviously students, for the moment anyway, need to be at certain places at certain times. There are schedules that have been built out way ahead of time for that. But you have support staff who are saying, I don't want to be here on Fridays, even though students may be there on Fridays. So that's another element that you have to factor in too, which is who needs to be around in support of the other clients or customers or whatever that are going to be taking up that space as well.
Yep. Yeah, and a lot of it is determining not all space and not all staff are alike, right? Some roles really need to be there all the time whenever the students are there. But there's other of those roles too that can be done remotely. We assume that counseling is best done face-to-face. Well, maybe that's not right. Maybe that doesn't work for a student who it's a struggle to get to campus, right? And so having remote counseling hours is actually a better, is a better arrangement for them, which could happen on Fridays. So there's those different relationships that we just can't, every time we assume something, we need to question that assumption to see if that's still valid and test it. It may still be valid, right? We don't want to say that everything's changed, because some of it hasn't. But we do want to kind of investigate some of the truisms that we held fast to prior to the pandemic.
You talked about data inputs, or the information inputs, both qualitative and quantitative. And one of the things that we have done multiple times here at GGU is to survey people about how comfortable they are coming in, how comfortable they are using public transit, whether or not short-term and long-term, are they going to be interested in coming back to work? If so, how long, or how many days a week, how frequently? But the arc of the pandemic has been changing too, and people's comfort levels and feelings about their experiences, I think, are changing. And maybe somebody who 6 months ago was saying, I do not want to go back into the office, anytime soon, or if I do go back, it's going to be on a very limited basis. Are you seeing that as we sort of gradually move to some new state of the pandemic, whatever that's going to look like? Are you seeing at all that those attitudes are starting to change and they sort of influence sort of the planning that you do? Because I'm getting the sense that some people want to come back now that maybe we're thinking they didn't want to before. They miss the office, they miss the people who they work with.
Yeah, I think certainly. I think the big difference is, for instance, folks as they kind of emerge from their shells, and I can use ourselves as an example, they want to go to an office, but that office is no longer really serving them because of this sort of, it's set up for old norms. It's set up with open, nothing but open cubicles and no ability to find a conference room. So that's, I think, some of the stuff that we're going to have to really look at is, what is the office? What is the draw? Because we all need a pull factor to get out of this sort of condition that we're in, whether we like it or not, right? We're all a little bit tentative about what the future brings, but we do know that the office has to then serve the needs that we have of it. And many of the offices are not, right? They're not set up for hybrid. So if you are going to be, having a workforce that's half in the office, half out of the office, well, then it's that hybrid state that's difficult to plan for in an office, right? So all of your rooms need to be set up for those hybrid environments so that no one from an equity standpoint feels that they're not in the room, right? And that's a big challenge that we're going to see, is how do you create that equity of experience? And how do you not tier folks who are in the office as either getting more face time or more immediate relevance than someone who's working from home? So those are going to be kind of questions that emerge. And without supporting that type of hybrid experience, this experiment will fail.
There was an article in the Wall Street Journal or New York Times or something like that about some people who have joined organizations during the pandemic and have worked exclusively at home, have never met the people they work with, and worked with them for more than a year, and are not particularly fond of that. And some of them are leaving and wanting to move to organizations, and have the luxury, by the way, of being able to move to leave their current position and move to an organization where there is in-person work. That was something that I didn't foresee, this whole idea that people are like, no, I need to be around people. I can't work in an environment at all where I'm not seeing any of my colleagues. Are you starting to see any of that at all?
Yeah, certainly. And also, some folks' home position, the remote setup isn't ideal, right? They're either caring for elder parents, they have a bunch of kids at home. The last thing they want to do is be at home and working. So, you have to kind of think about the condition beyond that. But I think it's definitely a trend that we're seeing. But I think that can be dealt with in many ways through as organizations start to really build policies around remote work. The problem is we've had this wait and see moment, and we haven't really made the policies that will put in practice what an organization is moving towards, right? And so the opportunity exists to create those interactive moments, and it doesn't necessarily have to happen in an office, right? You can have monthly events where teams meet. You can have quarterly events. It can change in terms of what those interactions are. And those interactions can then be predictable. I think what's going to be hardest is depending on serendipity, on people just deciding to come in on a day or not. The interactions and meetings are going to need to be a little bit more intentional so that folks can actually make plans around them, right? I have childcare needs. I need to make sure that I know when I'm going to be in the office, when our retreat is going to be, well in advance, things like that. Because what's hard on the life end of the equation is putting in place some of those things that help support our lives, right? And those can't just be sort of serendipitous. Those have to be planned. So I think that it's really a combination. Organizations can, without being a full workplace with everyone coming into seats every day, it can sort of start building in different ways of interacting and really turn more into a collaborative hub to host meetings, rather than assuming that folks will come in and sit at their desk throughout the day. And that's the way that the new office is going to look.
The work environment too is going to perhaps need to feel a little bit more human. I mean, we're having a great conversation here. We've all done probably 1,000 Zoom meetings by now. It's not the most human interaction necessarily. Now you're going to move into a space where you have some people at work, you have some people remote. Half of those people are going to be on Zoom in little boxes, and half of them are going to be sitting in a room. I saw somewhere something that I think Google or some tech company was working with, where they are creating sort of round meeting spaces. And instead of everybody on one screen, you have one person on individual screens. And then you can sort of look around the room and conjure up the idea of you being in an actual meeting, even though half the people are not there. So the work environment itself, it seems like, is going to need to accommodate, or at least change, in a way that makes it feel like not as sort of stilted in the way that it might be right now.
Yeah, definitely. And I think part of it is, we're going to start wanting to see our homes in the workplace, right? Throughout any given day, I will work at a desk in my bedroom or out in the living room and in the kitchen, and I'm moving around, or I'll go outside if it's a nice day. Those same sort of sequencing things are going to want to happen in the office, because we've become accustomed to that, and a certain kind of relaxed nature. I even think about wearing heels. It's tough for me to handle, right? And so just confronting that type of rigidity is going to be difficult for folks. And, you asked in one of our conversations whether the pendulum's going to swing back, and perhaps, but I do know that there's a different level of choice that we have. And a lot of folks are starting to question, why did we do that? What was it really important to who I was and how I conveyed myself in the office? And we're going to start, keep questioning those down to the core.
Here's a question that came in on the Q&A, and this is actually one that I was hoping to address earlier. So again, talking about the inputs that go into planning a space, and then how do you measure on the back end, and this is pre-COVID as well, whether or not the productivity is at the point or has improved in the way that you wanted it to, and happiness and you know and people enjoying the space. How do you determine whether or not you've sort of met your mark or the goals that you wanted to in what you built?
Yeah, that's a good question. And we use a couple of different techniques. I mean, obviously, surveying, but it's really important to not just assume, oh yeah, great. We designed the space and hope it works out, right? I mean, certainly when we're testing it, we want to find out if it's actually working. So we use, from really just measuring how people are using space. We use sensors that don't code anyone as an individual, but it's just data that we read to sort of look at dwell times in a certain space. How they're using and patterning through a space is really interesting. For instance, if we've designed a space to be a communal meeting space, are people actually using it that way? Or are we seeing 1, 2, 3 dots in a space rather than a big cluster? So that's stuff that we look at, regularly. And we also will survey folks throughout to kind of see if the space is working for them. Are we seeing utilization in the way that we had assumed it would? And if not, let's make some tweaks through some small interventions. So we're kind of constantly measuring and getting real-time data, as well as qualitative data from surveys and interviews on what we can do better. So it's kind of a mixed bag of ways that we measure success.
When in the pre-pandemic world, and we talked about this before, when there were just a handful of people who had telecommuting arrangements, I remember at some organizations I've worked for, there's a little bit of resentment over the fact that so-and-so either gets to come in at 10 and work until 6, or somebody gets to work at home 3 days a week because whatever reasons they have. Are we going to see more of that sort of tension and resentment now, or do you think we'll see less of it because more people are going to be participating in it and more people have the choice now to make the decision about working from home or working in the workplace?
Yeah, I mean, I think it will really depend on how flexible that policy is and for what sort of level or function of worker, right? Because some staff are really simply, if they're manning a help desk, whereas they might be able to automate or not automate, but they may be able to virtualize some of that experience, so that they can stay at home 1 day a week. That's still a gain, right, in terms of their ability to have more flexibility. But I think the policies need to really start fitting more individual needs and not be blanket, right? You can't just assume we're going to have a blanket policy about hybrid work. It needs to involve choice, and it needs to really be thinking about each staff member as a whole individual, and what benefits they might be able to give them that actually matter to that individual rather than just as an organization. So I don't necessarily envy folks in HR because it's a high task, right? You're really going to have to see everyone as a very individual that has different needs. But yeah, I think that will be essential for teams to communicate. And I think management is another really big element, because no manager has been trained for this unless they started out in a fully remote organization that was always remote and had built its whole culture and character around it, right? We're all learning, but that means a lot more training needs to happen so that managers can kind of manage in this new paradigm, which is new for most, but there are many companies who have done it well. You can create a sense of community, and also having different measurement tools. Someone asked about productivity that help gauge productivity from a manager's perspective. Are folks getting their work done? And because the old assumption that if you were working from home, you were dialing it in, we all know from feeling more productive during COVID in many instances that that's not true. But how do you measure that? And how does a manager feel confident about that, and have all the tools that they need at their disposal to manage a very diverse staff set?
Well, I imagine you just have cameras in everybody's home where the manager in the moment. Actually, I know of I've heard of at least a couple of examples where some people, when they work at home, they leave their cameras on all the time so that they all feel like they're working together, even though they're in all sorts of different locations, and they can just sort of pop up and ask somebody a question, I think they probably leave the audio off or something like that, but they're in different spaces, but they're acting like they're all in one sort of virtual space.
Yeah. Well, and there's also ways to show that you either have a green light or a red light on when you keep it on, so that you could sort of, you're doing heads down work, you don't want to be bothered, or you're open for, collaboration. So there's different ways and different tools to signal that. But yeah, I mean, it's much like what my daughter does. She studies with her friends, using FaceTime, so that they're all together, but they're all working separately, and now we're kind of finally aping what our children do.
That's interesting. So I wonder if that is a generational thing then, and if that will become a generational thing that we'll see play out in the workplace, or if that's just a kid thing that happens.
Well, I think we all seek communal experiences sometimes, and I think that those are about to be given to us, but they'll definitely be changed in the way that we experience them, and now we have forms like this that make it a lot easier.
I wonder also if I certainly have not seen this in our workplace, but whether or not we'll get to the point where there are fewer meetings, because Zoom meetings, I think there's a fatigue level that is definitely starting to take hold in a lot of places. And I'm wondering if we'll ever get to the point where people are like, you know what, we spent too much time on the video screen. Let's figure out ways to get our work done without having to because it's easy just to grab everybody and hop into a conference room and
Right.
lunch and stuff like that.
Well, that's what we're seeing too, is with folks who are going hybrid, so to speak, and they're refashioning their offices as collaboration hubs. So the idea is that of the work that I have in a week, I'll be doing my meeting work on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, and my heads down work, to the extent that I can plan that, is going to be on days when I'm at home. The days where it's more conducive to be at home in that type of relationship. So you're really looking down to break down, like, what are the activities I do in a week or a month, and what of those are best done in person, and what of those are best done at home. And a lot of it is just sort of the heads down focus work that a lot of folks are challenged with in the office, particularly in an open plan environment, right? You just don't have that level of focus. While you can build that into many offices, that space is at a premium. And I think that's the kind of new conversation, is understanding the value of space, right? So okay, space costs X. We have a budget of X, right? And in so many in the history, it's been, well, capital costs were over there and operational costs were here. And so you didn't really understand how to interrelate the cost of space, what that value was to your budgets. So by kind of highlighting that and having departments really understand their use of space and how much that is contributing to their bottom line or not contributing to their bottom line, they can start using it and leveraging it in ways that might help them. And if it means, oh wait, if we want 2 more offices, but that with that money we could actually hire a new research assistant or whatever that is, then that starts changing the conversation around what's possible. And so bringing that understanding of space into budgeting, I think is actually a phenomenon that's going to start happening more, because people are much more cognizant of what the value of space is.
So are we using too much space now? I mean, and I think about Twitter and Salesforce and some of these other companies that are saying work at home indefinitely. And Salesforce obviously has that mega tower south of the market in San Francisco. Is their footprint going to, and of other organizations as well, is it going to start to permanently shrink, do you think?
It's going to have to change, right? The uses that are in that footprint are going to be different. And yeah, it really is hard to justify having that much space in a difficult, even in downtown, given a workforce that's largely remote. So they'll have to find different uses for it. And I'm sure there are great uses for it. But it's definitely changing. And believe me, every organization is battling this question. What do we do with our real estate portfolio? And the wait and see approach is coming to an end, right? I mean, folks are really already starting to figure out, and many of our employees, were able to cut their space needs in half just by the way that they're planning on using space in the future. So that, if that means being able to sell off or repurpose a building towards another use, that's a big conversation, right? And will really impact that organization and their revenue generation.
One development that I certainly didn't anticipate was this idea. I think Google and maybe some other organizations have talked about compensating their employees less if they're not working in these big work centers anymore. So you worked in the Mountain View office and we paid you X. You've moved back to Fort Wayne, Indiana, where the cost of living is 60 or 70% of what it is in the Bay Area. Therefore, you shouldn't be paid as much because our salaries have been pegged to the cost of living in certain work centers. Did you see that happening? And do you think we're going to see more of that?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, that sort of calibration. It's going to be much more difficult to change the salaries of people who are already working places. But I think onboarding new positions is where that's going to be sort of introduced more because it's very hard to kind of take away. But yeah, we are seeing, I mean, there was this sort of mass move of folks from San Francisco to places like Austin, Texas. But, well, cost of living there is a lot cheaper and there's, the tax profile is very different. And so in theory, yes, you should, that salary goes a lot farther. But we might also see people coming back because of that, right? Because they left because it was such a economic decision for them. And if that's no longer the case, then, perhaps they might consider going back, or, which is also happening, another company says, no, stay as long as you want. We're not going to make you come in. And then that's where you see that, mass migration out of that workforce.
And maybe there's nothing wrong with a distributed work environment that doesn't place all of the pressure on the infrastructure of a few big urban work centers like the Bay Area and Los Angeles and New York and stuff like that. I mean, maybe it's okay that we start to sprinkle these knowledge workers out in different parts of the country.
Yeah, and I think also, I mean, there have been many employers who've, looked at these satellites, right? So if in fact folks do want to have an office to go to, well, people are planning smaller work centers, smaller satellites and hubs for people to go to in those areas. So what we're seeing is actually an expanding footprint just away from those centers. And as an urban planner, it's fascinating and also a little scary to sort of, see a disinvestment, divestment from the core of a city. And the hope, of course, is that we can get ahead of that with introducing new uses that are bringing people back into the city as well.
Right. Let's see. Couple of questions in here. Certainly, yes, less office work means less pollution, better for global warming. I think we could probably all agree on less traffic and less resources used. In Singapore, some regional companies did hot desking with people who were often traveling due to the high cost of office space. People who traveled a lot had their own a roll around file cabinet and can reserve an office. Is that part of this? It sounds like there are a lot of similarities there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's still the basics of where do I put my stuff, right? I want to have I don't want to have to reinvent my workspace every time I go. So I want to be able to leave things at the office. And so, yes, those rolling dollies is one. There's also lockers placed around spaces. All of those are important to have this sense of, you don't have to lug everything with you every time you do go to the office. And it needs to be as seamless as an experience as possible. And also, yeah, I mean, if you want to have a photo of your family and you bring it out for that day, God bless, right? We all have the things that make us happy. And so there's no point to sort of making things sterile. That's not the intention. The intention is actually, I think, to make things more vibrant and more diverse in terms of the experience that you have when you do go to a place. I think if anything, it elevates the role of place. It makes it more intentional. It makes us really think through the things that we need from it, rather than just assuming that it's a resource that will always be there.
So even pre-COVID here, in your work, when you go into an organization, presumably you've been invited into an organization to help them rethink the space. But I imagine there's always a contingent of traditionalists who don't understand why you're there or why you're trying to disrupt things. How much time do you find yourself spending with just the getting people to accept what you're doing aspect of the work?
Well, I think we start out without any preconceived notion of what we are doing, right? I mean, and it's important that these solutions come out of an evolutionary process where it's coming from you. We're not dictating this is how you need to be working. What we spend a lot of our time doing is revealing the patterns and letting our partners and our clients sort of make the conclusions, right? We're sort of dispassionate players in this game. We want to bring the data to you, understand what your goals are outside of space, and then help you understand is your built environment mapping to that goal or not? Is it hindering you or helping you? What are the ways that you can change that? So we never come out saying, oh, you guys need to, get rid of owned spaces. No, that's one potential solution that may come out of it. But I think a lot of times when you start seeing, how expensive that proposition is, or what other things you can't be doing because you've invested in everyone having their own private office and you're not able to do this, then our clients tend to make decisions that are more based in that reality. But I think that's a key. And then also really listening. I mean, we spent, as you know, Michael, a lot of our time sort of listening to a host of very different perspectives on an issue, all of which are totally valid, right? At a certain point, we don't spend a lot of time, trying to convince folks who are those traditionalists. We also have to look at, if we're looking at a plan that looks out 10, 15 years, we have to look at the next generation of user as well, right? How are they going to shape the space? What are their thoughts? And we can't rest on the sort of old know-how of someone who's been there for 20 years, as valid as that experience is as well. So it's really making sure that we listen to a cross-section of multiple voices, not just the loudest voice in the room. And then again, that it's not us making that determination. It's really coming from the folks we're working with.
We're coming up against the hour, but I have just one or two more questions. We alluded to this before. Will we regress to the mean, do you think, at some point post-pandemic and begin to, through some natural or unnatural forces, begin to sort of move back to the work paradigm that existed before pre-pandemic? Or is this permanent now?
Well, I think we're in a state of change right now, so I don't think there's any permanence to this state of change. I think people will always try to revert back to the pendulum swinging, right? And there will be a new norm, but some things are not going to go back, right? I think the relationship of individuals to work is not going to change. This understanding of how do I integrate work into a life is a new conversation, and one that's really critical, and one that we're all kind of having our own existential questions around. But for the first time almost, right? Our generation in many ways didn't question where we went to the office, how much time we spent. And those questions are, our generation is asking them, and you can definitely bet that the next generation is not going to compromise on those things. So I believe that is really going to change the way that employers hire people, the spaces that they create in order to accommodate them and attract them. But yeah, I think we're already seeing that yearning for, human interaction. But we're going to have to, in order to see the change that we want, we need to help shape it, right? Because people always revert back to the status quo or what they know. And so I think that's why this time is so important, and I think I applaud GGU for really, making sure that you didn't waste a good pandemic, right? Because it's really important to kind of make the change and create leaps that make people uncomfortable, even because you're trying to precipitate that change and accelerate it, and you have to create the framework for that, or else it won't happen. So it's got to be a mix of the two.
Well, and you talked about your daughter. Our kids now are watching this play out, and so we're establishing expectations and norms in their minds that they will carry on as they move into the college environment and eventually the work environment. So I imagine that will go a long ways towards establishing certain expected behaviors and environments that they're going to operate in.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, well, great conversation. Thank you so much, Marijke.
That's fun.
I think we've run through all the questions. So I just want to remind folks that if you go to ggu.edu and you search on GGU Presents, you will go to the GGU Presents page and you will find links to the YouTube channel, because this has been recorded and you'll be able to find it there. And we also are on lots of different podcast platforms, including Spotify and Apple and Google. So all of that information is there. We'll get this recorded and up on those various platforms within the next day or two. Thank you again. Thank you for everybody who took time to either from home or the office to listen today, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks.